Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit of a Christmas double feature essentially. So I'm going to be doing my retrospective on both Endless Space 2 and on Stellaris. Both games have actually changed quite significantly since when I first played them on our channel and did our Let's Play of them, but that's fine. We don't have to worry about that too much because I have got some ideas about what they're like now anyway. So anyway, I wanted to do a bit of a cross comparison here, so we're going to be talking first about the Endless Space 2 faction selection, because this is a major difference between them, and I think that it's one of the big compare and contrast sort of moments between these ideas and these sort of titles, because they have got a lot of similarities. And if you're a big strategy fan, a sort of grand strategy or 4X fan, then you're going to enjoy either of these games. But let's go through what would make one better than the other for certain types of people. So first of all, the faction select screen for Endless Space 2, there is a character customization or a faction customization option here. This does let you sort of make your faction a little bit better, but you can notice something interesting here. The number of points spent on the Vodiani as a base faction is 105 out of 95. We can go ahead and head backwards here and check out the Lumeris, hit the custom faction. They've got 110 trait points out of 100. So the core factions are a little bit stronger just in terms of the amount of points that they have, by contrast to what you could possibly make in your own customizations in some ways. The population here is lower. I'm not really sure how these sort of cross translate, but I get the sneaking suspicion that they're just breaking the rules for these a little bit to make it so that they're allowed to do just so that they can get them the way they want them to be. Now, the customization screen does give you tons and tons of different options, but I generally find that I don't really care much for it. You just don't really need to have anything in this sort of setup here. I generally find is that the individual factions are really just packed with a lot of interesting mechanics and flavor to their own. The three exceptions to this are that the Sophons, Lumeris, and the United Empire are relatively similar to one another, but everyone else has some sort of very unique faction gimmick that makes them operate in a way that's completely different from how other people work, and it almost feels like a new, refreshing type of game when you switch factions from one to another. I would say as well that each of the factions' branching storylines is a major selling point for this game. So if you're willing to play either a branching or almost linear sort of story, this makes the single-player experience a lot more enriching in this game. So if you want to experience the full Vodiani storyline, you'd have to do it twice through to get both the endings. Same thing for the Lumeris. There's three different sort of paths that you can play as with them. Same for the United Empire, and so on and so forth. I think there might be, I can't remember how many endings there are for each faction, but each faction has multiple different endings. And those stories are usually interesting enough in their own right. I think that since they're so tightly crafted into the lore of the factions and the aesthetics and the mechanics of the faction, these are really interesting events in a way that the events in Stellaris are not, because the ones in Stellaris have to be generic. This is you discovering something about the greater world and the world at large, and there are plenty of events in Stellaris that are extremely interesting, but they're not necessarily interesting in the sense of it reflecting your own society and culture and the choices that you're making. It's the world is sort of large and Chthonian out there, and weird things happen to you, whereas in this one it's very much about the decisions that you decide to make to shape your empire and sort of move forward. And I prefer that sort of storytelling in general. So I do think that the individual factions as they are already created is one of the biggest reasons why you would want to play Endless Space 2. If you like a certain playstyle, pick that particular faction. So for example, if you're very, very defensive as a player, you might want to consider playing as the Unfallen here, where you've got the Celestial Vines trait, which lets you sort of create these vines that sort of creep and crawl across the galaxy very quickly and allow you to easily defend your systems, because it's very, very difficult to attack into a system that has lots of vines. Your ships tend to move ridiculously slow when I'm going through those sort of vines there, and this helps protect them quite well. They're able to sort of turtle up, and they're +5 food on fertile plants, +2 food permanent, and their pacifistic sort of nature lets them sort of blow up in terms of size really, really quickly. It does make it a little bit harder for you to attack, but you can sort of get around that in the later game, depending on how you're playing. If you're a little bit more aggressive, you might want to play something like the Cravers, which are very, very well adapted to rushing. But the thing is that either of those factions can be used in other roles because they work well at sort of different things. If you're very, very good at very fiddly micromanagement and sort of population placement, Cravers can get sort of the maximum amount out of a planet and then sort of move their guys off that planet so they're no longer taking too many resources from it. And instead, that slave population will be able to sort of fill in the gaps there and take away a lot of the stress from that planet and give you tons and tons of resources that way. If you like sort of playing a slow, inexorable machine that just sort of accelerates as it gets going, playing as the Vodiani, I mean, these guys are an amazing faction in terms of the aesthetics and style and so on and so forth. Their playstyle is so much different, and their start is so much slower as well that they just play unlike any other faction in any sort of respect there. And, you know, if you're looking for something a little bit more generic, you might choose something like the United Empire or Lumaris or the Sophons. Any of those would be pretty normal. The one complaint about this factions screen is that this game does need more factions, I feel. It at the very least needs to have the 12 that you can get up to in the competitors there. So I do feel as though this game is a little bit too limited in terms of how many different factions you can have before you start getting into the sort of looping factions, which I don't really ever feel like playing. Now, if you're in a very, very large galaxy, the largest size there, you would obviously want to play with lots of other factions, and that would just sort of be how you do that. Or if you're playing with a large group of friends. But, you know, I'm not necessarily sure if these guys are going to put out any DLC that provides a lot of other factions, or if they're going to do free updates that provide lots of factions. I think the expectation is that you're going to want to simply have the customization if you really want to get into that sort of thing, but I really do think that this game has that potential. With each of the factions so intricately crafted and designed from the ground up with their own quest lines, their own unit aesthetics, and all that other stuff, I can definitely see why they might be a little bit hesitant or slow to produce new content in that direction, but I would definitely like to see that at some point in time there. Anyway, let's jump over to Stellaris. Alright, so let's take a look at the character or faction select screen for Stellaris. So this is vastly different, just in that it sort of separates out the character or faction select from the actual game options. So you select this first because there's a lot more likelihood that you're going to customize your faction. So let's take a look at them though. These are the individual default factions, and honestly speaking, there's not much about them that I find all that interesting. There's a little bit of lore behind all of them. They've got these biographies written in here that you can sort of browse through, but honestly speaking, there's not a whole lot behind each of these, and I don't necessarily find that they're as interesting. Their mechanics aren't as different from one another as you see in Endless Space 2, and their designs are not necessarily individually tailored or unique. They're from a sort of pool of aesthetics that you're allowed to sort of customize or choose from. So this is not a game where I would really highly recommend simply choosing one of the default factions. Instead, I would highly recommend creating your own faction. And you can see that I've actually made a bunch of them up here, and we've got sort of this option to create a new empire. So let's go ahead and into sort of looking at what that looks like. So first of all, you go into your appearance here. You can sort of get them to look however sort of you want there. You can give your species a name and all that other stuff. You can actually change the way that they randomly generate names for your faction. You can look at the traits that your species is going to have as a species as well. You can look at what your ruler is going to look like, although you know your ruler dies, so it's not like that really matters all that much. So you can just sort of customize that a little bit, and that's fine. You can change the name and type of your homeworld. Now, homeworld type does actually matter a little bit. You need to have the specific type of planet that your people are going to inhabit, which means that you can only inhabit planets of that type really easily. You can also inhabit the other ones down the column, but with more difficulty. So, like if you're on a dry planet, let's say a desert world, you can go on an arid world, but it's a little bit more difficult, and a savanna world, but it's a little bit more difficult, but you can't colonize an ocean world or a continental world or a tropical world. So you would have to sort of look for a world that fits your biology. And this does mechanically matter because people are going to be competing over specific types of planets, and that's typically going to depend on the sort of one that they started with. So, you know, if you're going for a humanoid type, you generally sort of go for like continental world, but you can go with whatever you want. There's no mechanical difference between the different planet types. It just changes who gets which planets. essentially. And you don't know which ones you're going to be seeing until you sort of get there. Next up, you've got your sort of ethics in your government, and you're going to be sort of selecting this for however you want to have your faction. You could have them be fanatic pacifists, you could have them be a sort of hive mind with a sort of hive mind government type there. You could have them be spiritualist, you could have them be materialist, and these all give sort of very small number bonuses. Now, none of these are so dynamically, dramatically relevant that you're going to say that I have to have that type over the other types. Generally speaking, what you're going to say is that, well, I mean, let's say that I'm going to go for a game where I decide to actually play with Syncretic Evolution. Syncretic Evolution works particularly well if you're going to be using the authoritarian system where you've got more slave resources. If you're doing that sort of thing, then Fanatic Authoritarianism could potentially be pretty good, where you're getting 10% more resources from those slaves. You could also, make the argument that if you're going to go that route, something like an imperial government might be interesting. So you could go for like a fanatic imperial faction that's, say, xenophobic, for example, and just be unpopular with absolutely everybody. And this would get you the ability to then have your you could then have your, where the hell is that, Syncretic Evolution and Slavers Guilds, which gives you humongous bonus production from your slaves, plus 20% for a lot of things. And then since you're going to take it with Syncretic Evolution, you end up with something like an extra, I forget actually how much, let's check Syncretic Species traits. This one is 10%, so that's 30%, and then you've got another 5% here. So you're looking at 35% bonus to mining minerals. And then you're allowed to also sort of muck about with these guys and make them even more powerful in that sort of regard. So there's a lot you can do to sort of customize and tweak the numbers, but ultimately these are just numbers bonuses, as opposed to the sort of different mechanics that are available to different factions in Endless Space 2. So no matter what you choose, you're going to end up with things that are relatively similar to one another in terms of how they ultimately play. It's just that some factions are going to have number bonuses. This makes them sort of more similar to the sort of Lumaris, Sophon, United Empire, where all their bonuses are primarily speaking in numbers and differences in ability to produce things through those numbers. You're, in this case, going to be seeing things that are just small shifts as opposed to completely different dynamics. The one exception to this, of course, is if you choose to be pacifist. A fanatical pacifist player cannot declare war, so that does make it really difficult to actually expand your empire at all. They get more core sector systems, but that doesn't really matter because everyone else will have taken them, and then the only way you can get them is through declaring wars, and you're not allowed to do that. So pacifists is not, it is a very different game if you're playing as pacifists. You have to sort of go out there, rush out with frontier outposts and get that space under your control, and then just get up to the cap number of planets really, really quickly. But after that, you have to somehow shift from being a fanatic pacifist to something else. Or you have to form like a coalition or something like that, or a federation, and have them get attacked by something. It's really awkward. But that's sort of the character creation or faction creation for this game. It's much more involved. It has much more moving parts. A lot of them are fairly minor. But it is interesting to sort of ply through them. And ultimately, I think the biggest reason that I like this system is because it really encourages roleplay, because since the bonuses to the numbers don't necessarily mean all that much, if I'm playing someone who's, for example, like blatantly materialistic, that means I'm able to get those robots with lesser upkeep and I'm able to get more research speed. Those are economic bonuses. It means I'll have a larger navy a little bit faster with more technology back behind it. Whereas if I'm taking somewhere like militarist, the army that I do have is going to be more powerful. Whereas if I take something like fanatic authoritarianism, I'm going to have a stronger resource production through that method, and so on and so forth. So each of these is going to either produce you a little bit more economy or a little bit more military or a little bit of something in between. But ultimately, everyone is just going to build a big blob of ships and they're just going to ram into each other. Now, they are trying apparently to fix the blobbing, where people just build a huge navy and have it smash in other navies. I'm not necessarily sure how that's going to end up working, but I get a sneaking suspicion that the optimal thing to do is still going to be to produce a gigantic ass fleet and have it ram into the enemy fleet, and then you'll probably win that way. But we'll see how that ends up working out when they actually get around to that. For my part, I think that it does work on the sort of scale that we're trying to sort of express through this kind of gameplay. Just whoever's got the larger navy should be the one that typically pulls out ahead, although I would like to see technology also matter a little bit more, because right now there's a sort of unbalance. Larger number of ships almost always beats a smaller number of more technologically advanced ships, I find. Unless you've got like a huge tech lead or something like that. Like they're just emerged out of the atomic age into the space age, and they've got like the probe that got the Sputnik 1 or something like that fighting your Death Star. So I mean, if you're seeing that kind of tech disparity, then yeah, 100 Sputniks is not going to destroy the Death Star. But you know, I would like to see that sort of addressed, but I'm going on a bit of a tangent. So yeah, lots and lots of little customization bits here. It's quite interesting. A lot of the mechanics down here are where the major differences are going to be. In particular, which of these you do is going to really change the mechanics of the game in a big way. But honestly speaking, I generally think that the game works best when everyone is forced to use the same type of FTL method. Otherwise, you get sort of really weird bullshit, like people sort of zipping around in circles, never being caught by anything, while still being able to outpace fleets by so much that they can sort of just take out a station and then bugger off to the other side of the galaxy. Really annoying when that sort of thing's going on. So, anyway, yeah, that's the sort of faction select. Much more customization options, much more interesting customization setup, and much more incentive to use it, but much weaker default factions. The ones that you are creating are going to be focused more on roleplay as opposed to sort of established lore or canon. And that's just sort of the differences between these two. So anyway, let's get into the early game and, yeah, the gameplay. Alright, and so here we are with Endless Space 2. So one of the things that's immediately interesting about this game is the fact that it does sort of encourage you in a sort of way to actually go into Ship Designer and start working on your own custom designed ships. And this isn't really true with the situation in Stellaris, where realistically speaking you can't really do anything with your ships since you don't have any open technologies. It would be nice in that sort of sense if you started off with a few things that you could customize and maybe make something that was specialized or a bit different. But instead, since you're stuck with only one type of ship in any given tier of ships, you can't really do that. You don't really have an option to sort of get ahead in that kind of way there. So generally speaking, you're going to find yourself not capable of advancing yourself technologically, or your ships technologically, until you've researched those techs in Stellaris. And this is one of the biggest advantages in this one, even compared to something like Beyond Earth or something like Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri. You don't really have the ability to actually produce any meaningfully different types of ships in the early game, or units, or explorers. It's going to ultimately just bail down to being the exact same type that you start off with some maybe minor changes if you really want to, but this one really lets you sort of go to town with that. And I really do appreciate that you can get some different strategies based on that. Maybe there's some sort of weird way where you can get an early game first turn just absolutely psychotic scout rush, where you just build lots and lots of scouts and have them sort of rush down your opponent. Maybe that's something that's possible in this game. I'm not really sure about that, but it would be pretty interesting to know if you could. Some factions just happen to have loads and loads and loads of attack power that they can load onto their ships, which is, you know, pretty interesting. So I think that that's, to a certain degree, something that is a strength to this game, and I think that's one of those things that you do want to have the ability to do. Have more varied starts, more varied things that you could opt to do, rather than being sort of locked into the same sort of build every time. Now, generally speaking, though, when you're playing these games, there is kind of a standard build and kind of a standard way to play the game, and that's perfectly fine. So what differentiates different 4X games in the early game, if that's the case? Well, in my opinion, it's how interesting and dynamic the scouting is. And this game has fairly interesting scouting, not in a way that I think is necessarily all positive, but it's certainly going to hold your interest if you're the sort of person who enjoys this kind of game. What is really interesting about this game is just how absolutely overpowered some of the things you can find through exploration are. We're probably not going to find them here, but you never know. Maybe we will. 2 atmospherics here. So, yeah, nothing there, basically. And cometites of volcanoes. So, +4 industry per population on that planet. That's actually a ridiculously huge bonus to have on planet. Now, admittedly, it's on a crap planet, but I mean, the fact that this now produces that much more in industry is a pretty substantial bonus. It does help out a lot in the mid to late game when I'm able to overcome the happiness penalty for inhabiting a toxic world. Now, I could also sort of have this world over here, and finding this type of planet, also a fairly substantial benefit. This large monsoon planet over here, Sakogoja, whatever, you're going to find out that these sorts of planets have way, way, way higher resource output, and they also produce something that planets normally don't, that being a tiny little bit of influence, which being able to get that, of course, is also a great thing to have access to. So, yeah, searching for things in the early game is basically like playing the lottery. It's exciting. It's got high stakes to it. If you can find something like, say, a really good missile launcher upgrade, you could potentially build a bunch of scouts and rush the ever-loving hell out of somebody with that, because the benefits of that are so ridiculously overpowered that you might be able to do something useful with it. You can go here and upgrade our ship here. Now, there's also things that you could find that might be useful in the sense of like being able to just build a couple of units, and those are sort of minor upgrades. This is where I think that this game sort of goes wrong. I think that for certain exploration types on planets, you should either always go big, always be like you found a new type of technology or something like that. But what they've sort of done is they've made it so you could potentially find something completely useless. You could potentially find a trap, actually, which is less than useless, and you could potentially find, absolutely nothing. You could just literally find nothing from some of these. And depending on what you find just by pure random chance, you're going to be ahead or you're going to be behind. And I think that this game really would have benefited if they had sort of had certain types of things that you could explore that were definitely going to give you something huge, like they did in Beyond Earth, which I think had a really good system for that, where, if you found a resource pod, you could pick it up and immediately have a decent benefit from it. Nothing huge, nothing groundbreaking, but if you found the ruins, on the other hand, you could sit on the ruins, you could use a very limited resource that you'd then have to take forever to get back, and get something really substantial, like, say, an entire population, or you could get a big boost to science, or you could find a relic or something like that. Or you could potentially find some sort of new technology, or even something like new affinity level, which was a huge deal in that game. If you found a free affinity level, you could get way, way ahead of someone else. So I think that to a certain degree they could have gone down that route. That might have been a little bit better. Let's see if there's anything that is likely to have something really good here. Yeah, so we're finding, like, these things are, like, minor and they're kind of good, but none of these are fantastic or anything like that. Like, it's always good to know all this stuff. It's good to find this stuff, but none of this is going to sort of revolutionize the way we play. Whereas, if we get lucky and find the improved Maggie laser, we could potentially just go ahead and kill somebody, because it's that much more powerful. It's over twice as powerful as the standard weapon, and it's even more powerful than the actual researched weapon. So if I went up to here, this is actually less powerful than the one that you can find out in the wilds. So I think that sort of is one of those things that is just a little bit too crazy, but on the other hand, it does mean that I feel really compelled to go out there and explore as much as I possibly can, maybe even building 2 or 3 exploration ships, getting baryonic shielding early, all those sorts of different elements to it. So I think that on one hand, it does kind of break the game to a certain extent here, but at the same time, it really does make it feel as though you just want to do it in a way that you just don't really care about in other types of 4X real-time strategies. So I do think that this is kind of a cop-out way to improve the early game in a game like this, but it really is effective. It does make you feel as though you're getting a lot of stuff done, even though all you're doing is sort of exploring a little bit. It does make you feel as though, you want to go out there, you want to explore, you want to see what's in the galaxy, and every turn's a little bit of anticipation that's more exciting than simply knowing that you're going to get a building for sure that next turn. So I do definitely feel as though they've got an interesting system here. I do think that it is a good one, but I do think that it also is a little bit unfair. So if you're really dead set against RNG, like I sometimes am, if I was playing this competitively or something like that against other people, or I wanted to win this against other people, or something like that, this would be a terrible system. But when you're playing it single player, this is actually fine. Like, there's nothing wrong with this style of play when you're by yourself or when you're playing against another person, or just in a sort of friendly match there or whatever. But yeah, I feel as though this is actually a pretty solid start to a game, the way that you sort of play it and the way that you sort of advance in it. So anyway, let's take a quick look at the starting of a Stellaris game. Alright, hey there YouTube, welcome back. So this is 15 minutes into the game, and I've been sitting here on speed 3 with a bunch of units set to way markers for about 15 minutes with fairly modest to little things happening. And this is one of the big things that I would say is a flaw with this particular game. If you want to refer to it as a flaw, you could view it as being fine. But if you're looking at the game from a strict gameplay point of view, I would definitely argue that you know, it is missing some different elements to it that make it kind of more interesting during this phase, because largely speaking, you just sort of skip through stuff as quickly as you can because nothing really happens. You're not going to typically find big bonuses. That's not really what you're hunting for. You're hunting for a bunch of little bonuses. You're looking for places to colonize. You're looking for events that will be interesting later, but which are not all that interesting right now. And one of the things that I would say about this sort of style of gameplay is that this is designed, I think, to create a legacy, a story about a nation that sort of first makes its first steps into space. But it's not really designed to emphasize really immediately gratifying or good gameplay. In fact, I'd say it's kind of the opposite of that, where very early on you're looking at really clunky, not that interesting gameplay for a fairly decent chunk of the game. I mean, we're 15 minutes into it, and I still don't feel as though I've really done anything all that satisfying. And to a certain degree, that's fine. Like, you don't need a game that's going to take this long to be immediately mechanically satisfying. What this provides is a sort of sense that you're creating a real faction here from the ground up, and you can sort of watch it grow from that sort of very ground level, creating this sort of story about their encounters and their voyages from way before they were able to enact any meaningful change in the galaxy. By contrast, you know, you're looking at something like Endless Space 2, you're kind of actually already competent at whatever it is you're trying to do there. So I definitely feel as though this game is going for a very different sort of direction in terms of what it's trying to accomplish there. But at the same time, it feels sort of as though it is still definitely a slower, less interesting game because of it at the start. I do think that the opening phase is primarily going to interest people who want to read through all of the text for all of the individual little events here. And see exactly what all the little story beats are for their particular faction, and to create their sort of own lore about it, and to have careful records and stuff like that. And that all is pretty interesting if you're playing it that way. But just looking at this from a gameplay perspective, just a strict gameplay perspective, I do find that this gameplay at the start here is really kind of lacking in terms of interest curve. Like, I'm not really doing all that much here. You just sort of right-click a whole bunch of places. You just have your science ship queued to go from place to place to place, and preferably not to the place that has the deadly probe that's going to kill me. Let's go ahead and explore that, I guess. Interesting. Well met. So these are things that I've met like a million times before because they're in every single game. Ancient Automata. This is interesting. So this is the kind of thing that is interesting. I'm not going to get very likely anything too good from this. Like, if you were to compare this to Endless Space 2, there's the possibility that going through this quest chain would give me something like, say, an improved laser or something like that. That's not going to happen here. What it's going to get me is a few research points, probably, or maybe a little bit of advanced technology research so that I can research something a little bit faster. But none of those bonuses are huge. You're not going to win the game based on the accumulated bonuses from these sorts of events here. So you can ignore these almost completely and still be fine. But being able to read this and be like captivated by sort of the story is in itself is sort of its own reward in that sort of sense there. So yeah, I think that definitely, I don't have a skill 3 scientist though. So I think that this game definitely is a storyteller's kind of game. It's not really that kind of game for people. this isn't really the kind of game for people who just want to go ahead and win it in an efficient way. If you're doing that, there's plenty that you can do to do that, but it's not too difficult and it's not too interesting doing it that way. You'll be skipping a lot of the story, like I do. And, well, the reason actually I skipped a lot of the stories is I've read a lot of the story notes already, so it's a lot less interesting for me to do so. So that's actually one of the reasons why I do it. But if it's your first time playing through and all you want to do is like optimize and win the game, you know, this isn't really the game for that. There's the winning of this game is kind of mundane and kind of boring, honestly. You just take over a whole bunch of the galaxy. So the early game sets you up for the mid game and the late game with that in mind, with the idea that you're going to be better suited to playing this game with a sort of role-playing aspect in mind to it. So anyway, let's get back into the game in a little bit here when we can sort of take a look at some of the combat. Alright, and we're sort of back to Endless Space 2, so let's talk a little bit about just the way the game looks. I think that people are going to maybe have mixed opinions about the overlay here. It's not necessarily the most clear thing in the world, since you've just got these very indistinct wireframes with these numbers above them. There are little things that help you sort of identify what is what over here, like we've got this ship without the hourglass, and then we've got this one with the hourglass. And it's usually not too hard to remember what's going on where, but there are definitely moments where I'm trying to figure out what the hell's going on the map there, and I'm missing things because of the way that the whole sort of system works. Which, you know, is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. It is something that you can get used to. But I think that the style of it is one that's going to be a little bit, you know, some people are going to like it, some people are not going to like it. You know, it's that kind of system. It's not the one that sort of everybody is going to look at and think is brilliant. I think it's going to be sort of one of those ones where you're going to either love it or hate it, sort of thing, or be indifferent to it, honestly speaking. I think there are plenty of people who are going to sort of look at it and just be like, you know, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. And I think that that's also a perfectly valid sort of a viewpoint of it. Personally, that's sort of actually where I stand. I think that there's nothing really wrong with it, but I don't think it's fantastic or brilliant in any sort of way, shape, or form. Now, the exception to that is I do think that the battles look really good in this game. And I think there are going to be some people who disagree with that. I've heard before that the camera work is a little bit janky in this game, and I do think that the auto camera does sort of have its sort of moments of idiocy, but generally speaking, you're looking at this game in the battles. That's where you want to be seeing things. That's what is exciting to watch. Now, you are only watching those battles. There's nothing interactive really about them once they've sort of gotten underway. But that similarly is also fine. There's no reason that you need to have battles be overly engaging in a system like this, because that's really not how 4X strategy games typically work. Generally speaking, they're all kind of just auto-resolve calculators, and this is a game with an auto-resolve calculator. That is how combat is progressed in this particular game. So the thing about it is that you're going to be able to sort of watch and enjoy the cinematic of the ships blowing each other up. And if you're like me and that's what you really want to see out of a game like this, ships blowing each other up, then this game is fantastic. There's nothing really at all at odds with what I like in that. So if you're looking for a more in-depth tactical experience, obviously, I would definitely recommend maybe checking out the Battlestar Galactica game that came out fairly recently as something that might be up your alley. But for me, it's just really not that, you know, this style of thing is just perfect for what I particularly like. So it's going to come down to preference. For music and sound effects, this game's combat sound effects I think could be a little bit beefier, but the music I actually think is quite good. The leitmotifs of each of the different factions all sound quite good if you ever listen to the soundtrack. It's not too obtrusive. Nothing is super catchy. You're not going to listen to any of the songs in the soundtrack and think that's the best song I've ever heard. You're going to sort of listen to it and think, yeah, that's a pretty good song. And, you know, you're going to hear the soundtrack as you're playing it, and you're going to think, yeah, that's a pretty good soundtrack. I think it does what it needs to do, but it's not outstanding or anything like that. I wouldn't say that this is one of those games that you play for the soundtrack. I wouldn't say it's a game that, you know, has an amazing soundtrack. I'd just say that it's got a passable one. But it does what it's supposed to do, and I think it does it pretty well. So that's my sort of opinion there on the game and of its sort of little technical details of it. But anyway, let's get back to Stellaris. Alright, and we are back. So now it's time to get into our first little bit of combat, and now we can talk a little bit about the way the game looks. So, the game itself, I think that the UI looks a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more sleek, and a little bit more usable and functional than the UI in Endless Space. And I actually really do think that, given how much information there is on the screen at any given time and how much is going on at any given time in this game, they do a pretty good job of making it so that everything is represented quite simply and easily, so you can tell what's going on very, very quickly at a glance. I do think that, however, the space combat is something that is a little bit lagging behind. Now, in isolation, though, for a grand strategy game that is, again, largely running on auto-resolve, because this is largely auto-resolved combat again, it does still look pretty good. But I don't think it looks as epic or as impressive as the sort of gigantic sort of clash of ships where you can see every sort of impact and really hear every impact in Endless Space. So the battles here are definitely a little bit more abstracted here in the sense that you just sort of see blips running towards each other and then a bunch of bright flashes and then they explode. That's kind of how it works in this game. And there isn't anything particularly wrong with that. That's far better than what you would get from most Paradox Interactive grand strategy type games, which is to say you'd get a man icon, or like if you were to do what you would expect from them, you would see like a token for a unit sort of walking towards another token for another unit, and they would sort of have a generic firing animation at each other until one side retreated, and that's how their combat, generally speaking, works. This obviously looks a lot better than that. Now, there is also a little bit of strategy and maneuver to the game as well, which is kind of interesting. It's based around, simply put, whoever can get to the flanks of the enemy. Sometimes you can sort of get around to the sides or the edges, and that lets you decide which of the ships you're going to be attacking first, which can sometimes make a bit of a difference. Attacking from an off angle can sometimes allow you to beat up a ship that you wouldn't otherwise be able to take out. Which is kind of an interesting fact there, but in general speaking, it's not too big a deal that you're going to be able to do that. I think that this game generally is a good-looking game for what it is. The only thing that I really would like to see more of, though, is a sort of overhaul for the game in terms of I would like to see big space battles between iconic cruisers to your empire, like something that is the flagship of your empire or something like that, that really stands out and is more big and impressive than you would see from everyone else. You don't really sort of see that kind of thing in this game. Generally speaking, what you see is like everybody's got kind of the same looking ships from a distance, and they've got a gigantic swarm of them. And that's just sort of the nature of the gameplay right now, and I think that that's something that they could sort of change. Apparently they're working on it to make it a little bit less based around blobs, but I think that that's always going to sort of be a graphical thing about the game. For sounds and music, I think that the game actually works quite well. Again, the music's got the sort of very retro sci-fi feel to it to me, but I actually really do like the music in this game. I really do like the sound effects in this game. It, again, is not necessarily too in your face. You don't really hear it as the predominant thing, but it is definitely there, and I definitely do quite like it. I've listened to both soundtracks by themselves. I do think that I like the Endless Space one a little bit more for certain factions. It's a little bit more operatic, a little bit more epic in feeling. This game sort of got a kind of a dystopian future kind of vibe from the 80s, which I think is kind of nice, but that sort of 80s synth music is what it sort of feels like to me from time to time. But it is pretty good music. The sound effects are quite good. There's no real voice acting in this game, which is a bit of a shame. I'm not really sure how they would do it, considering how many different species there are, and they'd have to sort of go through and make all sorts of weird voices for them, I guess. But it would be kind of a nice addition. It's not a necessary one, though, so I can't really say that I care too much that's not in there. But yeah, I think that this game is pretty good looking. Everything is designed to be, more than anything, immediately communicative of what it is, immediately usable, so that you can easily get into the game and get the information that you need once you understand what exactly it is you're looking at. And that is something that's more practice rather than the UI being bad or anything like that. I think that all in all, because of this, it's a little bit more clear, and I do like the style of it, especially when you're zoomed out like this and looking at the campaign map. I do like this map a little bit better than I like the map from Endless Space 2. So yeah, let's get back to Endless Space 2 for our wrap up of that, and then we'll get back to this one. Alright, so let's get a little bit into sort of the ideas in the mid-game and sort of later on into the game here. Now this is not actually that late into the game, but this is going to be a bit of a battle that we can sort of watch and sort of discuss when we talk about this. Now, this game does really open up in the mid-game. This is where you're sort of into your quest line, you're being able to use large fleets with powerful abilities, and you're up against other opponents who are doing sort of similar things. And you're not sort of in that last-minute race or slog to the finish line where you're hoping that you're going to be able to complete whatever stupid quest that you happen to be on. You know, you're focused on just sort of using the strength of your faction, building up big ships, and sort of having interesting designs. You haven't got those big doom stacks that can sort of roll around and just kill everything just yet. Here you can see, like, we've got a fairly mediocre fleet already. And despite that, it's still carving into these guys. Beam weapons look interesting. I really like the look of these space battles. You know, I really do. The scan button makes it fairly interesting as well, but I can turn that off for now. So what exactly is the sort of midpoint to the end point of this game? Well, you're largely speaking going to be building up big fleets. You're finding new planets, and this is where you start fighting other factions. Now, one of the criticisms I would have of this game is that combat is far too much the only way to sort of win the game, other than to just sort of camp. It'd be kind of interesting if there were more diplomatic options towards victory that might be available, or more sort of dynamic ones, or if, you know, to do the military victories, you needed to do something more than just create a gigantic Doom ball or something like that, which I tend to find, you know, build a few Doom stacks is generally speaking the way to go about it, but I have no real solution to that particular problem. But it'd be nice, for example, if you're going for the economic victory, you had to do something a little bit outside your borders a little bit more often, if you had to negotiate with other players a little bit more, you know, get maybe into a position where you could buy their stuff a little bit. I think there's a lot of potential there, but as it sort of is, you just sort of sit there and camp until you've got it, which is not necessarily the most entertaining of things. I do think that the combat, though, in this game is interesting enough that I don't particularly mind the fact that I'm just getting into these big slogs and trying to fight my way out of everything, essentially. I do find that that's rewarding enough as it sort of stands. So I do think that to a certain extent, you know, you don't necessarily need to have much more than that. So this game does slow down, though, once you do have that, and, you know, everyone's on the run. This happens in every game of this genre, like I've mentioned. You get to that point where nobody can oppose you anymore. You've got all of the resources. You've got nobody. There's nobody left that can sort of oppose you in your military tyrannical rule, and you just sort of carry the game the rest of the way with that. And, you know, that happens about maybe 100 turns in a standard game. You know, it doesn't take that long. So the games are fairly short, so once you do get to that endpoint, one of the things about this game is that if you don't have it on the ridiculously large maps, it's pretty mercifully short. You start winning, you win, and that's sort of about the end of it. You don't have to go through a hideously long process, which takes you a long-ass time, to finish off people who are already defeated. You know, you still have to, but it's a fairly short process by contrast to what you see in some of these sorts of games here, which I do appreciate. You know, factions that are dying just finish dying a little bit faster. Factions that are winning just win a little bit faster. That's kind of how this game kind of goes right now. I'm not necessarily sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing in your point of view. Some people like the ability to have those big come-from-behind victories that happen in certain games. I'm not necessarily saying that that's a bad way of doing things, but it's definitely not really my cup of tea in these sorts of games to have that happen for too long. You, generally speaking, want to have these situations resolved within a fairly reasonable amount of time, in my opinion, and this game's pretty decent at sort of making sure that happens, typically. Haven't really played against people. There might be sort of opportunities for that to change in those instances, but I do think that it's probably likely that once a player starts losing against real people as well, unless he gets some sort of negotiation with them, he's probably still going to lose that. That's just my sneaking suspicion about the matter. But yeah, I think that's just about everything I've got to say about this game. Play it for the battles and for the story about each of the individual factions. But if you're really looking for something innovative or new, there's not a whole lot to it that it really is. I feel like this game is your typical sort of 4X game set in space. Nothing wrong with that. I do think it does a decent job of exploring the genre. I think it does a pretty good job of making sure that you have fun doing the things that you would typically do in this style of game. And I think there's nothing in particular that I think I dislike about it in particular. So anyway, yeah, if this isn't your cup of tea, let's go back one last time to Stellaris. Alright, and we are back. So what would I say in conclusion about this game? This game ultimately I feel is a fantastic sort of game for roleplay, for creating sort of an empire and having it be, you know, interesting and having it follow from what you sort of would imagine your space empire would look like. But ultimately speaking, I don't necessarily think that I don't necessarily think that the gameplay lends itself well if you're just trying to take over the galaxy, or if you're just sort of stomping over everything. I don't necessarily find it too interesting to play that way. Now, some people are going to disagree, and they're going to say that that's the best part of playing this game, but I do think there are other games that do that sort of space combat a little bit better. What immediately sort of springs to mind for me is actually Sins of a Solar Empire. I feel is a better game for that style of play. So, for me, if I want to go ahead and crush a bunch of enemies and have a strong military and stuff like that, I want to play something more like that. That's sort of the game that I feel is a little bit better. But when I feel like I want to create a story, when I want to create my own unique empire, when I want to sort of have an idea about what I want a space society to look like, this is the game that I prefer playing. I think that it's probably one of the best ones for creating your sort of own civilization in a way that matches with the way that you want it to. I don't think that there really is any other system out there that works quite as well as this one towards that goal. So I do think that for that style of gameplay, for that style of whatever it is you want to do, this is definitely going to be the one that you want to be playing at. And, you know, sometimes you're going to have situations where you want to have one thing or you're going to want to have another. Now, one of the things that sort of holds this game back from being just the conquer everything kind of thing is that the combat really is a little bit bland for an auto-resolve type of combat. Again, you know, that is the standard for these sorts of games, is that they all sort of just rely on auto-resolved combat. But this game in particular feels very, very heavily as though it just is built around beating the ever-loving crap out of things in ways which are not necessarily that entertaining, because honestly your ships don't really do too much. They just sort of fly towards the enemy, and you know, they do one thing or they do another, and some stuff explodes. Basically, it's not necessarily too engaging. You see some particle effects coming from your ships, those slam into the enemy, you can't really tell what's going on, you can't affect it anyway, and then some ships explode, and that's about it. It's not even necessarily that easy to tell precisely why it is that your ships are winning or losing, which I find is another bit of a problem. It's not a huge problem, honestly speaking, but I do find it to be a bit of an issue. I would like it a little bit more clear just from looking that I'm losing for one reason or another, although, you know, they've got the post-battle information and statistics that should be telling me that information anyway if I was paying more attention. That is there. It's not as though it's their fault that I'm not getting this information, necessarily. So, yeah, I think that this game, though, is for a specific type of player, more so than I think Endless Space 2 is. Endless Space 2, I think, is going to be fun if you're the sort of person who plays Civ, if you play any sort of 4X games. It's going to be the sort of thing that you're into. This one, I think, is more for a dedicated sort of role player, as well as somebody who plays this sort of stuff down. I think that that's sort of just the way that this game works out. So you're going to have to figure out what your priorities are. Another thing to note about this game, there's a lot of DLC and there's a lot of constant sort of updates to it. If you're the sort of person who really has an affinity for these sorts of games, and it's missing something that you would really like, maybe check out some of the DLCs. Now, I don't recommend buying this game, even if it doesn't appeal to you right off the bat, because a DLC might fix it. That would be nonsense. What I'm recommending, though, is that, you know, you look through the game, you sort of give it a very careful scrutiny and see if this is what you would like, more so than other games. I could safely recommend Endless Space 2 to a lot of people that I know that like sort of Civ-style games and those sorts of video games, but I don't necessarily think that I would necessarily recommend this particular game to everybody out there. I think that this is one that would go to very specific-minded sorts of people who like very specific things. Vast empire building, the ability to sort of build a story around their own individual faction, the fact that they've got such high level of customization for the faction to make it sort of their own story about their own imagined sort of space fantasy group. I think that ultimately is what we're sort of looking for here when we play this game, as opposed to sort of something like Endless Space, which is much more about creating some sort of very large space empire that just blows up ships in big action space opera-y kind of way. So different games, different sorts of people. If you know of anyone who sort of would like this game, of course, maybe go ahead and grab it for them for Christmas. So in any event, that's our reviews for today. Fairly simplistic reviews. We didn't want to go over too many of the technical details, but realistically speaking, these are the sorts of games where if you're interested, I would recommend you sort of take a very close scrutinizing look at them, because they're not necessarily the easiest games to get into. There's a lot of sort of moving parts to this genre of games, and you don't have to play this type of game. Honestly, there's lots of people who I know don't like this style of game, and there's nothing wrong with that. So anyway, I hope you found this episode enjoyable, and of course, as always, I hope to see you guys all next time.